On this episode, we talk in depth with a geographer about pedestrians in Geneva, Switzerland. Stay tuned.
We're in Geneva talking with Sonia Lavadeno, who's a geographer. What's your specialty?
Well, I deal mostly with pedestrian strategies and the way people tend to walk and why they walk and the reasons that give them hints to walk longer in the city. So the idea is to talk about the pleasure of walking. So I wrote a book about that. It's called Marche Plaisir, so the pleasure of walking and how we can enhance that pleasure and make people walk more in the city, more often, longer distances.
What do pedestrians want? What makes walking pleasurable?
Well, actually, one of the things that they really want is to interact with, well, of course, interact with other people, have places to actually not just stroll, but also sit and spend time there. So a lot of attention when trying to encourage people to walk is actually towards encouraging people to sit and just remain in a place long enough so that they use it. Maybe what has changed, in my opinion, from the 19th century parks or 19th century plazas is that in those days we had a lot of time to sit and a lot of time to remain in public spaces. What I now advocate is more the idea of creating micro instants of pleasure, and so that you could stay around for, say, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and then continue on your trip, and then maybe move to another public space and enjoy that public space in a different manner. So it's actually kind of a strips of connecting public spaces. They don't have to be that monumental. They can be smaller. So it can be pocket gardens or pocket plazas or pocket parks and all these things. What's important is that they're conceived in a dynamic way rather than a static way, so that you can actually just encourage people to walk more, in the sense that they will use these places as climbing stepping stones to then move on with their lives and do the regular things that they have to do within a day, but they just use these public spaces along the way.
So what you're looking at then is when pedestrians actually stop walking is when things happen.
Yeah, indeed. That's actually when walking is taking place in your head. Is like, why would I walk? I walk because I want to go to these places where things happen and where I can stop. So actually, the more places you put in where people can actually stop and do things, the more people will walk. So it's not that much about making walkable, physically environments that are walking friendly, but it's more about putting in social environments that are walking friendly, in the sense that there are enough intensity of things happening there that give me incentives to walk and go towards these places. And then how can I ease the crossings from one place to the next?
So what's been happening with pedestrian planning here in Geneva?
Well, here in Geneva, it's been a long strategic planning, and at the same time very opportunistic, in the sense that the ideas are there, they are in the drawer, as usually ideas are, but then each time there's an opportunity, they're already at the ready so that you can take them out of the drawer and actually do something about it. So the pedestrian master plan has been around for quite a few years, since 1995, and it's been slowly, gradually coming up, and the city has been refurbishing itself, and most neighborhoods now have attained that stage where they are really pedestrian friendly. One of the major challenges here was to make inter-neighborhood walking friendly, because we know now from data that we have both in Switzerland and also in Spain and other places like in Bilbao and Barcelona, they did a lot of studies on that, and you really see that it's when people really start walking from one neighborhood to the next that things really start changing in terms of modal transfer, in terms of letting the car at home and doing other things. So it's more this idea of what we call marche augmentée, so it's kind of augmenting the range, extending the range of walking, and pushing walking in with other modes. It could be, of course, public transport modes, but also shared modes, or even private modes such as the bike or the car. And so the idea is that you extend the capabilities of the walker. It's kind of like having a big wardrobe where you'd have a lot of dresses, different dresses, and I call that speed dresses actually. And for me, it's kind of like the idea of a multimodal city is you have this very large wardrobe with all sorts of different speeds that you can wear. So it's kind of like when you want to go a bit faster and you want to go a bit further, you just pick up one of those speed dresses and you dress yourself up with that. But then it has to be either a shared mode or public transport mode, because then you don't have to care about where you're going to leave your car or where you're going to leave your bike. So you just dress and then you dress up and down. It must be just as natural, just as easy as the walking itself. So in that sense, that type of multimodal city is what we're trying to bring about here in Geneva and also in other cities in Switzerland, and it really works well. People really have that type of behavior where they walk, and if at one moment they're tired of walking or they want to do something else or they want to go a little bit faster, they just hop on a tram or hop on a shared bike or hop on a boat, and they just go for a little stretch, a little bit faster and longer, and then they resume walking. So it's all about short stretches of walking and then short stretches of whatever, and then going back to walking. So that's the whole strategy of this augmented walking reality that we're talking about.
And you're talking about connecting neighborhoods. What sort of barriers are there that divide the neighborhoods apart?
Usually the barriers are pretty much as in everywhere. You have these large roads where we used to have a lot of lanes. We basically went on a very big road diet program where most of these large arteries that came into the city, with the tramway program, they were reduced down to usually just 2 lanes, maybe sometimes 4 lanes if it's still an important artery. But basically they were mostly downgraded both in speed and in width, and so that makes it fairly easy to cross. What we try to promote here is a lot of informal crossing, so we're not banishing pedestrians from doing whatever they want in terms of line of desires. They just can pick up any desire line that they want and basically cross everywhere. And so we try to make that possible even in large arteries where it wouldn't be that easy beforehand to do that. Wherever it's possible, we really try also to, even when there's traffic lights on, we try to give priority in the traffic light system. And this is also even a national policy that we're now developing. There's a whole program, even for the national roads. The ones which are usually 50 kilometers an hour or 70 kilometers an hour, even for those roads, the main arteries, we're trying to get more friendly, pedestrian-friendly and cycling-friendly traffic light systems. So it's going to make crossing those large arteries even easier. And then other main points is major crossings, which usually are very complex, and we try to simplify those and give more space, not just for pedestrians, but just for the friction that inevitably happens in these places. So where there's a lot of friction, you need a lot of space, so we just try to give that space and let people free to roam around and do whatever their own business and do the negotiations that they want to do. So those major crossings have made a major change in the way people go around in the city. The other thing that we try to do is to activate, and it does come with those changes in public spaces, try to activate active frontage and make it more and more interesting for people to be on the streets and walk, and try to create these cross links between the neighborhoods in a way that people are encouraged to actually cross and be in another neighborhood without even noticing that they have decided to go to a different place in the city. They only kind of remember that once they're across. So it's kind of like just making it easier to step from one neighborhood to the other. So in that way, we managed to make the average trip, pushing it towards 20-minute, 15-minute, 20-minute walk, even maybe easier. It's much easier now to make a 30-minute walk than it was. So we're not talking about 5 minutes or 10-minute trips. It's more about pushing the quarter of an hour to half an hour trips.
And you mentioned federal policy on roads. How many of the roads in the city does the city actually control, and how many are at higher levels of government that they need to work with one way or another?
Yeah, most roads are city-controlled roads, and actually some of them have been downgraded so that they could be city-controlled roads. Today it's only the major arteries that go in the city that are still what we call a cantonal road, so they are on the higher level. Federal roads are not. It's only highways that are federal, so that's not that much of a problem within the cities, even though sometimes you have these urban highways, urban stretches, but that's not that much of a concern here in Geneva. What we do have is cantonal roads, but there have been experiences also elsewhere in Switzerland where these cantonal roads are now becoming more pedestrian friendly, more in a speed regulation that allows some friction to happen, and that's what we're now experimenting, as I was saying, at the federal level. So that's not just in Geneva but elsewhere, but it is thanks to pilot experiences made in Geneva and in Zurich and Basel, so the big cities where this has been happening, and so they also understood that it is feasible also in smaller cities such as Lies, which has become totally 30 kilometer per hour place. It's a small place, 15,000 people, such as Burgdorf in the canton of Bern, which is now, it has been for a while, the model city for pedestrians and bicycles, and that's where they tested the whole scheme of shared areas, which we call encounter areas, zone de rencontre, Begegnungszonen. These were all tested there, and before they became national policies. That type of places really have gotten its kind of experimental fields. And what's interesting in Switzerland is it's very easy to go from one level to another. It's not because you've tested that in a very small place that big cities wouldn't import it, and vice versa. It's not because you did something in Zurich or Geneva that very small cities would not import. And so people actually tend to import ideas even though the scales are totally different. So I find that's one of the things where in Switzerland that type of imitation goes both ways and works really well across all the scales of all the urban scales.
And what's happening? You have the city of Geneva itself, but then you have all the surrounding jurisdictions, and even across the border into France, very nearby. What's going on in the areas surrounding the city itself?
Indeed, here, for a very long time, it was Geneva City, the City of Geneva Center, that was carrying the policy for the pedestrians. Now the other surrounding cities, which are smaller of course, but also quite important pockets of population and jobs, they have also taken up these pedestrian-friendly policies, and it kind of makes a wave that contaminates the whole territory in the end. And so it's interesting now to see that it has risen up to the canton level, and the canton has released also a pedestrian and bicycling master plan for the whole territory of the Geneva canton. So that includes quite a few dozen smaller cities and even villages that are scattered around the whole territory. And now with the what we call the Grand Genève, so the large metropolis of Geneva that includes France. So now there's a lot of discussions also with new public transport that's coming in with big connections, train connections and tramway connections going all the way across the border. So that also injects more urbanity in places where prior we would call these edge cities, or places where there's not that urban quality. But now this urban quality is really reaching the whole borders of the metropolitan region. There's quite a few efforts to build on the urban nodes that are already existing there and expanding them towards the new neighborhoods that are being created, and building these new neighborhoods already in a much more walkable way. And I'm not that worried about the new neighborhoods themselves. I'm pretty sure they'll be walkable because they are thought walkable from the start. The whole challenge is to then connect these with the existing urban tissue and make sure that everything is going to work fine, and not just consider the links from a perspective of, as I was saying, 300 meters or 500 meters, which then kind of implodes the walking perimeter and makes it smaller, but rather considering these large links, these cross links in between the neighborhoods. And so when you do that, in the end, we can really push towards having 1 kilometer, 2 kilometer links where people really can walk. And it's not to say that they will walk every day the whole link, but it is to say that in their mental maps these links exist, and they know that the city is walkable, and if they want to do it, they can do it, and if they have the time to do it, they will, and if they don't have the time, they will make a shorter stretch of that link, but still the mental idea of it exists.
So what's the future for pedestrians and walking in Switzerland? What's our opportunities and challenges ahead?
Well, SUVs have still been selling pretty well in Switzerland, so I'm pretty sure the car is not dead yet. It will continue to cohabit. I think one of the big issues is how we're going to maintain that cohabitation and make sure that the friction is going all right. And also maybe not try to be too much into the other side of things, tipping it towards too much security issues. I would like it to remain more on the pleasure side of things, because when we're talking about modal transfer, I think it's the pleasure side of things that brings this modal transfer about. And here we have taken, contrary to other places like France or other countries, we for the moment have escaped this tendency to make a defensive stand, and we try more to be on a compromise stand with the other modes. And I think that's but it's not like a weak compromise, it's more like on a strong compromise of quality of living and using the space, giving the space up for the people, and not specially to one mode or another mode, but it's more like giving the space for all the social networking that happens when people are outside in a street sharing the space. And so I think in that sense, the future of pedestrians here is pretty bright in a way, I would guess. You could say that, because we are gaining, each year we gain more space, more shared space. So it is, in a way, a space where you can still circulate with other modes of transport. And I find that pretty realistic. It's not just creating pedestrian islands or places where you would be feeling very comfortable as a pedestrian, but then you would be kind of trapped in that area, and that area would be pretty short. The way we've been doing things here in Geneva, basically in the end the whole city is yours, and that's what's so interesting about it, is that it's really very walkable all over. And so it's not just privileging some neighborhoods or some spots, some plazas, but it's more like the whole city in a kind of very low-key way, and not that costly, and maybe not that spectacular, but for the daily needs it's more than enough, and people in the end walk more everywhere, and walk more in every neighborhood, and walk more for every reason also, or every motive. So I think in that way it's very democratic. It comes out as the whole neighborhood's benefit, and not just one part of the city or the city center or some of the parts. So I think it is a very, in terms of equity, in terms of access, in terms of serendipity, the place is going forward and going further in the good direction, definitely the best direction we could want. So I find it's good.
So just what is a shared street, and how difficult are they to create?
Well, they're not. Yeah, well, they are difficult to create in the sense that you have to talk a lot to get the thing done. In the case of Rue Les Chaux, the one we saw prior, is a street where there was a lot of discussion to create this cross-link. There was a real need because of the university and all the commercial vitality of this neighborhood, which is very dense, very popular. There's a lot of people living there, and there was a lot of demand for commercial vitality, but the sidewalks were very small, and the business couldn't really expand, couldn't really thrive. There were businesses there, but they were just kind of floating just on the offside of getting run down. And when we tried to do something with these two streets, Rue Les Chaux and Rue Patru, the idea was to build this crosslink in a very low-key way. So the idea also of doing that is because we don't want to spend the money on just one operation. We want to be able to actually replicate and do a lot of low-key interventions, not just one. And it's in the synergies of having several of these low-key operations linked together that then people would start really walking. In this case, in the end, it's more than 1 kilometer that was refurbished in several sections of these low-key interventions. So the interesting thing about it is how then the private sector follows up this kind of interventions. In this case, there was a whole new vitality that was brought in, and the whole commercial typology of the place has changed, and we got new businesses that got in, lots of restaurants, lots of cafes, terraces, a lot of people walking, a lot of people cycling by, and more people, of course, attract more people. So in the end, it just becomes a thriving place to drop by. And if you have to consider crossing Plain-Palais, a lot of people would actually go out of their way to then now cross Plain-Palais through that link, which before was not the major link. And it's definitely also took off some pressure of other places which are still very complex to cross, and that we couldn't do that much of an effort there because there was so much car traffic and so much public transport as well, which is complicated to deal with and inject pedestrians there. So creating these alternative crosslinks really allows, really kind of takes off the pressure from the whole sector, and at the same time makes it better for this particular area to thrive in terms of both socially and economically. And at the same time, the other areas are not so stressed with all the pedestrians coming into one single place. So we kind of level out. And that's also what I tried to do with the Geneva train station. The Geneva train station also is a place where we tried to insert several places where people can cross and where people can come in and out. I did the same with the Lausanne train station. We were just working on the project of the new Lausanne train station. There as well, there's a main pedestrian artery that connects the city center to the train station, and it's very heavily trafficked with pedestrians. And it's a bit too much. So what we wanted to do was to create alternative ways for people to cross from the city to the train station and vice versa. And now we're planning on doing 4 or 5 of these crosslinks. So in the end, people will be able to choose. I think the whole business here is to give more opportunities, more alternative route choice for people to be able to choose other routes than the usual, very heavily trafficked pedestrian routes. So the more you make for a thriving urban ecosystem where you have more of these low-key, low-investment streets where it's so easy to cross from one neighbor to the next. In the end, it's the possibilities of having alternative routes that make it work. The more alternative routes people have, the more they will walk. So they can go one way in, come one way out. So that really makes a difference afterwards in the whole system. And the good thing about it is that with the money that you would use to create a very large operation, we can maybe make 8 or 10 of these. So it's the expansion that it creates within the network of the whole city. With the same amount of money, you can really go much faster. In, say, 3 or 4 years, you could basically do the whole city in a city such as this one, which is, I would say, not as large as American cities, but still. So that's basically also what motivates us, is to be able to do it, say, 3 times or 4 times faster than you would if you would do it in a classical way, bringing in first the big plazas and the big public spaces, such as the French way of doing these things usually is.
Visit us on the internet at www.pedestrians.org.
This tells you the level, and just red and white. It's just your basic walk. With black, it's more difficult.
Okay, no, just wondering.